I've been driving logging roads in British Columbia for 15 years. That's long enough to know every cut block, every turnoff, every washed-out bridge between Prince George and Fort St. James. I know which roads flood in spring and which ones the black bears use as corridors in summer. I know where the cell service drops and where the old trappers' cabins are hidden back in the bush. After 15 years, you don't get surprised anymore. The forest becomes predictable, mapped out in your head like the streets of your hometown. But last November, I found a road I'd never seen before. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, and I was heading back from a site inspection near Germanson Landing. The days were already short by then, that deep autumn darkness coming on fast around 4 in the afternoon. I'd taken Highway 27 south, the route I'd driven hundreds of times, when I saw the turnoff. Just past the old forestry checkpoint, maybe 10 kilometers north of the junction, there was a road branching off to the west that I didn't recognize. I slowed down, confused. I'd driven this stretch the week before. Hell, I'd driven it 3 days before. The turnoff hadn't been there, I was sure of it. But there it was, unmistakable. A gravel logging road cutting into the forest, unmarked, no gate, no signs. The kind of road that should have had at least a designation number or a warning about active logging. But there was nothing. Just the opening in the trees and the pale gravel disappearing into shadow. I should have kept driving, that's what my gut told me. But 15 years of working in the bush had made me curious about things like this. New roads meant new operations, new contracts, information I should probably know about. And there was something else, a kind of professional pride, I guess. I didn't like the idea that there was a road in my territory that I didn't know about. So I turned in. The road was wider than I expected, well-maintained, and the gravel was packed firm under my tires. But the trees on either side were wrong. Old growth. Massive cedars and spruce that hadn't been touched by logging, their trunks thick as my truck was wide, their canopy so dense it choked out the remaining daylight. Old-growth forests like that were rare now, mostly protected, and I couldn't understand why there'd be an active road running through one. The trees were too close, too. The road cut through them in a way that felt claustrophobic, the forest pressing in on both sides like walls. I've driven through plenty of tight-cut blocks and overgrown deactivated roads, but this felt different. The darkness under the canopy was deeper than it should have been, even for late afternoon in November. My headlights seemed to get swallowed up by it, barely penetrating 20 feet ahead. I drove for maybe 5 minutes before I started to feel uneasy. The road kept winding deeper, turning and switchbacking in ways that didn't make sense for a logging road. They're usually built straight as possible to move equipment efficiently, but this one curved and twisted like it was following something a creek bed, maybe, or some old trap line. Except I couldn't see any water, and there were no other signs of human activity. No skid trails, no cut stumps, no survey ribbons, just the road and the trees. My GPS stopped working first. The screen went blank, then flickered back on, showing my location as a gray void with no roads, no landmarks, nothing. I wasn't too worried GPS cut out all the time in the bush, especially in deep valleys or heavy forest. But then my phone lost signal. Not unusual either, but the timing felt off. I'd had 2 bars just before I turned off the highway. I kept driving. The road was still good, still passable, and I figured it had to lead somewhere, maybe to a newer cut block or a research site I hadn't heard about. But the forest wasn't changing. The trees stayed massive, ancient, their bark dark and wet-looking in my headlights. And I started to notice something else. There was no sound, no wind in the branches, no birds, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth. Just the rumble of my truck's engine and the crunch of gravel under my tires. After about 20 minutes, I checked my odometer. I'd driven almost 30 kilometers since leaving the highway. That didn't make sense. The road had been winding, sure, but not enough to cover that distance in 20 minutes. I looked at the forest again, trying to spot something familiar, a lightning-struck tree, a distinctive rock outcrop, anything. But it all looked the same massive trees, the same dense canopy, the same suffocating darkness. That's when I noticed the road behind me was different. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw that the road I'd just driven down didn't look the same. The curves were wrong. The angle was wrong. It was like the road had rearranged itself after I'd passed, reshaping into something new. I told myself it was a trick of the light or my memory playing games, but my hands tightened on the steering wheel anyway. I decided to turn around. I found a wide spot, pulled a three-point turn, and started back the way I'd come. But the road didn't look right. The curves I remembered weren't there. The switchbacks had changed. I drove for 10 minutes, then 20, then 30, and nothing looked familiar. I should have hit the highway by then, should have seen the turnoff, the checkpoint, something. But the road just kept going, winding through the same unchanging forest. My fuel gauge caught my eye. I'd had 3/4 of a tank when I left the site. Now I was down to half. That was wrong. I'd driven maybe 40 kilometers total, not nearly enough to burn through a quarter tank. But the needle sat stubbornly at the halfway mark, and when I did the math in my head, the numbers didn't add up. I kept driving. What else could I do? The road was the only option. On either side, the forest was impenetrable, the undergrowth thick and tangled between those massive tree trunks. Even if I'd wanted to abandon the truck and walk out, I wouldn't have made it 100 meters before getting completely disoriented. The light was fading fast now, what little of it had been filtering through the canopy. My headlights cut through the darkness, but they seemed weaker somehow, like the forest was absorbing the light. I started to feel a pressure in my chest, not panic, not yet, but the beginning of it. That creeping realization that something was very wrong, and I didn't have a plan to fix it. I drove for another hour, maybe longer. Time started to feel slippery, hard to track. My phone was useless, still showing no signal, and my truck's clock seemed to be moving too fast. The odometer kept ticking up 50 kilometers, 70, 90. I'd burned through almost a full tank of gas, and I still hadn't found the highway. The road kept changing behind me. Every time I checked the rearview mirror, the curves and angles were different, like the forest was rearranging itself in my wake. I stopped checking after a while. It was easier to just focus on what was ahead, to keep my eyes on the gravel and the trees and pretend that everything was normal. I started talking to myself, stupid things, just to hear a voice, reminding myself that I'd been in worse situations, that I'd gotten unstuck from mud holes and navigated whiteouts and dealt with equipment failures in the middle of nowhere. This was just a road. Roads led somewhere. I just had to keep driving. But the pressure in my chest kept building, and the forest kept pressing closer. Then, finally, I saw light ahead. Not daylight, it was too late for that, but the pale glow of headlights on pavement. The highway. I felt a surge of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I accelerated, pushing my truck faster, desperate to get out of the forest and back onto familiar ground. The road spat me out onto Highway 97, just south of Vanderhoof. I knew the spot immediately. I'd driven past it 100 times, but it was wrong. Vanderhoof was 60 kilometers south of where I'd turned off Highway 27. There was no way a logging road could have carried me that far, especially not in the direction I'd been traveling. I pulled over onto the shoulder, shaking. My hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel, and my back ached from sitting rigid for so long. I checked my phone. It had a signal again, full bars, and the time said it was almost 8 at night. I'd been on that road for over 3 hours. I looked at the odometer, 340 kilometers since I'd left the site that afternoon. That was impossible. The site was maybe 80 kilometers from where I was now, and I'd only driven on 2 roads, Highway 27 and that unnamed logging road. There was no combination of routes that could have added up to 340 kilometers. I pulled up the map on my phone, zoomed in on the area between Highway 27 and where I was now. There was no road, nothing but forest and a few old deactivated trails, none of them longer than a couple of kilometers. The road I'd just driven for 3 hours didn't exist. I sat there for a long time, staring at the map, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I drove home. I didn't know what else to do. My truck was fine, my fuel was low but not empty, and I was shaken but unharmed. I told myself it had been some kind of mistake, a wrong turn, a mental lapse brought on by fatigue and the late afternoon light. But the mud on my tires told a different story. It was thick and dark, the kind of mud you only get deep in old-growth forests where the ground never fully dries out. And there were things in it, fragments of bark and pine needles that didn't match anything near the highway. I reported it the next day, called the Forestry Service, told them about the road, the old-growth forest, and the GPS failure. The woman on the phone listened politely, asked for my coordinates, and then put me on hold. When she came back, she said there was no road in that area, No active logging, no recent permits, nothing. She suggested I'd gotten disoriented, maybe taken a wrong turn onto a deactivated road and looped back around without realizing it. I didn't argue. What was I supposed to say? That the road had changed behind me, that I'd driven 340 kilometers on a route that didn't exist? She'd have thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. I went back the next week, drove Highway 27, watched for the turnoff. It wasn't there. I drove it again 2 days later. Still nothing, just the empty stretch of highway, the forest on either side, and no unmarked gravel road branching off to the west. But I see it sometimes now. Late at night, when I'm driving that route alone, my headlights will catch something at the edge of the road. A gap in the trees, a pale strip of gravel disappearing into shadow. It's always in my peripheral vision, never quite straight ahead. And every time I see it, I feel that same pressure in my chest, that same creeping dread. I never turn in. I don't slow down, don't look too closely. I just keep driving, eyes forward, hands tight on the wheel. Because I know if I take that road again, I might not come out near Vanderhoof this time. I might not come out at all. And the worst part is, I don't think I'm the only one who's seen it. Last month, I was at a truck stop near Fort Street James, and I overheard 2 other drivers talking. One of them was describing a road he'd found off Highway 27, an unmarked turnoff that led into old-growth forest. He said he'd driven it for hours, said his GPS had stopped working, said the road seemed to change behind him. I didn't join their conversation. I paid for my coffee and left. But as I walked out, I heard him say something that made me stop cold. He said the road was still there, that he'd seen it again just last week, and he was thinking about taking it just to see where it really went. I wanted to go back and tell him not to warn him, but what would I say? That some roads in the forest aren't really roads at all, that they lead somewhere that can't be mapped, somewhere the forest doesn't want you to leave? I got in my truck and drove away, and I try not to think about what might be waiting on that road, or how many other drivers have turned onto it and never made it back. But sometimes, late at night, I see it again in my rearview mirror, that unmarked turnoff, that pale gravel road disappearing into shadow, and I wonder if one day I'll be too curious or too tired to resist, if I turn in one more time, just to prove to myself that it was all a mistake, all in my head. But I know better now. Some roads don't lead anywhere you want to go, and some roads, once you take them, don't ever really let you leave. My uncle's fishing cabin sat on the Skeena River, about 40 minutes outside Terrace, in a spot so remote you needed a boat or a 4-wheel drive just to reach it. He'd built it himself back in the 70s, right after he moved to BC from Alberta. Built it on stilts because of the spring floods. The Skeena swells every year when the snowpack melts, and if you're not careful, you'll lose everything to the water. But my uncle was careful. He knew the river, knew its moods and rhythms. That cabin had weathered 40 years of floods without taking on so much as a drop of water inside. We used to go up there every summer when I was a kid. My cousins, my parents, my uncle and aunt, the whole family. We'd fish for steelhead and salmon, sit around the fire at night, listen to my uncle tell stories about the old days when he first came to the valley. It was tradition, the kind of place that feels permanent, like it'll always be there waiting for you. In June 2019, we made the drive up for our annual trip. My cousin Derek and I went ahead in his truck to open the place up and get the generator running. The rest of the family was coming up the next day. It was a bright afternoon, warm and clear, the kind of weather that makes you forget how brutal BC winters can be. We took the old logging road in, the one that winds along the riverbank for the last few kilometers, and when we finally came around the bend where you can see the cabin, Derek slammed on the brakes so hard I nearly hit the dashboard. The cabin was underwater, not partially flooded, not sitting in high water, completely submerged. The river had risen at least 20 feet above its normal level, maybe more, swallowing the cabin whole. We could see it down there, through the murky green water, the roof just barely visible, the stilts disappearing into the depths. The water was calm, glassy, not moving like a river should. It just sat there, still and heavy, like a lake that had appeared overnight. Derek and I got out of the truck and stood at the edge, staring. Neither of us said anything for a long time. The thing is, there hadn't been any flooding that year. The spring runoff had been light below average, actually. We'd checked the river levels before we left, because my uncle always made us check. The Skeena was supposed to be running low. And even if there had been a sudden surge, it didn't explain what we were seeing. The water wasn't rushing or churning. There was no debris, no muddy current. It was just there, as if someone had filled a massive bowl and left it sitting. I pulled out my phone to call my uncle, but there was no signal. There never was, this far out. Derek was still staring at the water, his face pale. He'd grown up on this river same as me, had spent every summer of his life at that cabin. He knew it wasn't right. Then I saw the lights. Down below the surface, inside the cabin, there was a faint yellow glow coming from the windows. The lights were on. I could see them clearly through the murky water, steady and warm, like someone was home. Like someone had just turned on the lamps and was sitting inside, waiting. Derek saw them too. He took a step closer to the water's edge, squinting. "That's not possible," he said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "The generator's off. Even if it wasn't, the water would have shorted everything out." I didn't have an answer for him. We stood there watching those lights glow beneath the surface, and a cold feeling started to spread through my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. It was more like wrongness. The kind of feeling you get when something fundamental about the world stops making sense. Derek turned to me, and I could see he was thinking about going down there. He'd been diving since he was 16, had his certification and everything. I knew that look on his face. "Don't," I said. "We should just go back, get my uncle, figure out what's happening." But Derek was already walking back to the truck, pulling his dive gear out of the bed. He always kept it with him during fishing season, said you never knew when you'd need to check a net or retrieve a lost lure. He started pulling on his wetsuit, moving fast, not looking at me. "Derek, seriously, something's not right here." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm going down. Maybe there's a pump running, maybe someone's squatting in there. I don't know, but I'm not leaving without checking." I tried to talk him out of it, told him we should wait, that the water didn't look safe, that those lights didn't make any sense, but he wasn't listening. He zipped up his wetsuit, put on his mask and fins, checked his regulator. The whole time, those yellow lights kept glowing beneath the surface, steady and patient. Derek waded into the water, and it swallowed him up almost immediately. The visibility was terrible. He disappeared after just a few feet, his silhouette fading into the murk. I stood at the edge, watching the spot where he'd gone under, counting the seconds. My heart was pounding, though I couldn't have said why. It was just a dive, just checking on a flooded cabin. Nothing dangerous about that, but something in me knew it was wrong. He was under for maybe 30 seconds, no more than that. Then he surfaced, exploding out of the water with a gasp that sounded like a scream. He ripped off his mask, his face white as paper, eyes wide and wild. He swam for shore with desperate, thrashing strokes, and when he reached the edge, I had to grab his arm and haul him out because his legs weren't working right. "We have to leave," he said. His voice was shaking, barely controlled. "We have to leave right now." "What did you see?" "We're leaving now." He wouldn't say anything else, just kept repeating that we needed to go, that we couldn't stay here. He didn't even take off his wetsuit, just threw his gear in the truck bed and got in the driver's seat, hands trembling so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. I tried to ask him again what he'd seen down there, but he wouldn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, and drove us back down the logging road faster than was safe. We called my uncle from town, told him the cabin was flooded, that something was wrong with the river. We didn't mention the lights or Derek's dive. My uncle said he'd drive up the next day to assess the damage, but Derek cut in and told him not to. Told him to stay away, that it wasn't safe. My uncle got quiet on the line, and I could hear the concern in his voice when he asked what had happened. Derek just said we'd explain later and hung up. We stayed in Terrace that night at a motel. Derek barely spoke. He sat on his bed staring at the wall, still in his wetsuit, and when I tried to get him to talk, he just shook his head. Around midnight, he finally said something. He said, "There's someone in there, in the cabin, but it's not right. The way they were sitting, the way they looked." He stopped, swallowed hard. "We can't go back there." I didn't push him. We left for Vancouver the next morning, and Derek didn't tell anyone else what he'd seen. Not my uncle, not his parents, not anyone. He just said the cabin was flooded and we should stay away until the water went down. A week later, my uncle drove up to check on the place. He called me that evening, confused. The water was gone. The river was back to its normal level, exactly where it should have been for June. The cabin was fine, dry, untouched, everything in its place. No sign of flooding, no water damage. Even the generator was right where he'd left it, bone dry. He asked me what Derek and I had really seen. I told him the truth, that the cabin had been 20 feet underwater, that the lights were on inside, that Derek had dived down and seen something that terrified him. My uncle went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The lights were on?" "Yeah." Another long silence. Then, "I'll have someone check the wiring, make sure everything's safe." But I knew he didn't believe it was a wiring problem. I could hear it in his voice. Derek never went back to the cabin, wouldn't even talk about it. That next summer, when the family planned another trip, he made excuses. Said he was too busy with work, that he couldn't get the time off. But I knew the real reason. Whatever he'd seen in that cabin under the water had broken something in him. I went up once more, 2 summers later, with my uncle. The cabin was fine, everything normal. We fished, grilled salmon, sat around the fire like we used to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The river seemed too quiet. The cabin felt hollow, like something had been taken out of it and not put back. Last month, I got a call from my uncle's property manager. My uncle had passed away the year before cancer, and the cabin was being prepared to sell. The manager said they'd gone in to do a final walkthrough and clean the place out, and they'd found something strange. In one of the bedrooms, tucked under the bed, they'd found a diving mask. A good one, professional grade, with a cracked strap and algae dried on the rubber. The manager wanted to know if it belonged to anyone in the family. I told her it didn't. Derek's mask had been red and black, a cheap recreational model. This one was yellow and gray, the kind commercial divers use. She asked if we wanted to keep it, and I said no, told her to throw it away. But the call wouldn't leave my head. I kept thinking about that mask, about who it might have belonged to, about whether someone else had gone down to that cabin while it was underwater, before Derek and I got there, or after. Or maybe while we were standing on the shore, watching those yellow lights glow beneath the surface. I tried calling Derek to tell him about it, but his number was disconnected. I asked around, found out he'd moved away from BC entirely, gone to Ontario or somewhere back east. No forwarding address. Just vanished, the way people do when they're trying to forget something. I think about that day a lot now, about the cabin sitting beneath 20 feet of water that shouldn't have been there, about those lights burning steady in the windows, about whatever Derek saw that made him so desperate to leave, and about that diving mask they found under the bed, covered in algae, belonging to no one we knew. Sometimes I wonder if the cabin is still down there. Not the physical cabin my uncle built, but some other version of it, sitting at the bottom of a river that only rises when it wants to be seen. And I wonder if those lights are still on, glowing faint and yellow through the murk, waiting for someone to swim down and take a look. I won't be the one to find out, and I hope to God no one else does either. But the river's still there, and the cabin's still standing on its stilts, weathering every flood season like it always has. And every time I think about it, I remember Derek's face when he came up out of that water, white and terrified, and the way his hands shook when he said we had to leave. I wonder what he saw. What was sitting in that cabin under the water, with the lights on and the river calm and still around it. And I wonder if it's still there, waiting. I've driven the Coquihalla Highway more times than I can count. It's the main route between the coast and the interior of British Columbia, cutting through the Cascade Mountains in a series of steep grades and tight curves that can be beautiful in summer and deadly in winter. I've driven it in every kind of weather, rain, fog, black ice, whiteouts. After 20 years of making the trip for work, you get comfortable with it. You learn where the avalanche zones are, where the wind hits hardest, where to watch for wildlife crossing. You develop a rhythm with the road. But last February, something happened on the Coquihalla that I still can't explain. It was a Friday evening, and I was driving from Vancouver to Kamloops for a job site inspection that couldn't wait until Monday. The weather forecast had called for light snow, nothing serious, but by the time I hit the base of the summit, it was coming down hard. Big, wet flakes that stuck to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet. The kind of driving where you grip the wheel with both hands and focus on nothing but the taillights ahead of you, if there are any. I was alone on the road. Most people had the sense to wait out the storm or take the longer route through the Fraser Canyon, but I'd driven through worse, and I had a deadline. So I kept going, crawling up the grade at 40 kilometers an hour, my headlights barely cutting through the wall of white. Just past the snowshed summit, the highest point on the highway, I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder, just off the pavement, facing the road. A young woman, maybe early 20s, wearing jeans and a light jacket, not a winter coat, not even a hoodie, just a thin denim jacket that looked soaked through. Her hair was plastered to her face, and she wasn't moving. Just standing there in the snow like she was waiting for a bus. I almost didn't stop. You're not supposed to pick up hitchhikers, especially not on the Coquihalla in a snowstorm. But something about the way she was standing there, so still, so exposed, I couldn't just drive past. She'd freeze to death out there within the hour, maybe less. I pulled over onto the shoulder about 20 feet ahead of her and put on my hazards. Through the rearview mirror, I watched her walk toward the truck. She moved slowly, deliberately, like the cold wasn't affecting her at all. When she reached the passenger door, she opened it and climbed in without hesitation. No thank you, no explanation, nothing. Just got in and closed the door behind her. I turned to look at her. Up close, she looked even younger than I'd thought. Pale skin, dark hair hanging wet and limp around her face. Her jacket was denim, faded blue, with no logos or patches. She wasn't shivering despite being soaked through. She just sat there, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "You okay?" I asked. She didn't answer right away, just kept staring ahead. Then quietly she said, "Hope." "You're heading to Hope?" She nodded once. Hope was about 100 kilometers south, back down the mountain. I was heading north to Merritt. I told her I could take her as far as the junction, drop her off at the rest stop, where she could maybe catch another ride, or wait for the storm to clear. She nodded again. I pulled back onto the highway and kept driving. The snow was still coming down hard, but the road had leveled out past the summit, and the going was a bit easier. I kept glancing over at her, trying to figure out what her story was. Why she'd been standing out there in the middle of a snowstorm with no proper gear, no bags, nothing. She didn't look injured, didn't look distressed, just wet and quiet. "You got family in Hope?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She didn't answer. I tried again. "You need me to call someone when we get to the rest stop? Let them know you're okay?" Still nothing. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, staring ahead. Her jacket was dripping water onto the seat, but she didn't seem to notice or care. I gave up on conversation and focused on driving. We'd been on the road for maybe 10 minutes when I glanced over at her again. I don't know why. Maybe I heard something, or maybe I just felt like checking to make sure she was okay. But when I looked at the passenger seat, she was gone. Just gone. The seat was empty. The seatbelt was still buckled, hanging there across nothing. The door was closed. The window was up, but she wasn't there. I nearly drove off the road, slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop on the shoulder, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared at the empty seat, trying to process what I was seeing. She'd been there, right there. 10 seconds ago, she'd been sitting in my passenger seat, and now she was just gone. I unbuckled and twisted around to check the back seat. Empty. I reached over and touched the passenger seat where she'd been sitting. It was wet, soaking wet. The denim jacket had left a damp outline on the fabric. I could see it clearly, but she was gone. I threw open my door and got out, stumbling through the snow to check around the truck. Maybe she'd jumped out somehow while I wasn't looking. Maybe I'd missed the sound of the door opening. But the snow around the truck was undisturbed except for my own footprints. No tracks leading away, no sign that anyone had gotten out. I checked the passenger door, locked from the inside. I opened it and looked at the seat again, still wet, still empty. I stood there in the snow, the cold finally starting to register, and felt a sick, hollow feeling spread through my stomach. I got back in the truck and sat there with the engine running, staring at that wet seat. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, from something else, something I couldn't name. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around, drive back up the highway, look for her. But look for what? A woman who'd vanished from a locked truck while it was moving. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I'd picked up a hitchhiker who'd disappeared into thin air? They'd think I was drunk or high or suffering from altitude sickness. But I had to report it, had to tell someone. So I kept driving, slower now, and when I reached the highway patrol station in Merritt, I pulled in. The officer on duty was a middle-aged guy with a thick mustache and tired eyes. I told him what had happened, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound crazy. I'd picked up a hitchhiker in the snow. Young woman, early 20s, light jacket. We'd been driving for about 10 minutes when she disappeared from my truck. No, the door hadn't opened. No, I hadn't stopped. She was just there, and then she wasn't. The officer listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're the third person this month." I stared at him. "What?" "Third person to report picking up a hitchhiker on the Coquihalla who disappeared during the drive." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Can you describe her?" I did. Dark hair, pale skin, early 20s, light denim jacket, soaked through, heading to Hope. The officer's expression changed. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. He stood up and walked over to a bulletin board on the wall, pulled down a piece of paper, and brought it back to me. It was a missing persons poster, faded and old, the edges yellowed with age. The photo showed a young woman with dark hair and pale skin. She was smiling at the camera, wearing a light denim jacket. "This her?" the officer asked. I looked at the photo, and my mouth went dry. It was her. Same face, same jacket, same everything. The poster said she disappeared in January 1996. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She'd been hitchhiking from Kamloops to Hope when she vanished. Last seen on the Coquihalla Highway, near the Snowshed Summit. No trace of her was ever found. No body, no evidence, nothing. Almost 30 years ago. "That's her," I said. My voice came out hoarse. The officer nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting it. "You're not the first," he said again, "and you probably won't be the last." I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't elaborate. Just said that people see her sometimes, especially in winter, especially during snowstorms. They pick her up, try to help her, and she disappears. Always the same way. Always between the summit and the rest stop. The officer said the RCMP had investigated it years ago, back when the reports first started coming in, but they'd never found anything. No evidence of foul play. No explanation. Just people who swore they'd picked up a hitchhiker who vanished into thin air. "What happened to her?" I asked. "The real her, back in 1996. The officer shrugged. "Nobody knows. She disappeared, maybe got picked up by the wrong person, maybe wandered off the road and froze. The Coquihalla's not forgiving in winter. People die up there every year." I looked at the poster again, at Sarah Mitchell's smiling face. 23 years old, disappeared almost 3 decades ago. And somehow, she was still out there, standing on the side of the highway in the snow, waiting for someone to stop. I asked the officer what happened to the other people who'd reported seeing her. He said they were fine, shaken, like I was, but fine. One of them had been a truck driver, the other a paramedic. Both of them solid, reliable people. Both of them adamant that what they'd experienced was real. I left the station feeling hollow and off balance, like the ground beneath me wasn't quite solid. I drove the rest of the way to Kamloops in a daze, barely registering the road. When I got to the hotel, I sat in the parking lot for a long time, staring at the passenger seat. It had dried by then, but I could still see the faint outline where the water had been. Proof that she'd been there. Proof that I hadn't imagined it. I tried to sleep that night, but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing on the side of the highway, wet hair plastered to her face, staring at nothing. I thought about what it must have been like for her in 1996, standing there in the cold, waiting for someone to help, waiting for someone to stop. And then something had happened, something bad enough that she never made it home. The job site inspection the next day was a blur. I couldn't focus. Couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Mitchell and the other people who'd seen her. I wondered if she appeared to everyone who drove that stretch of road in winter, or just some of us. And I wondered why. Was she looking for help? Trying to tell someone what had happened to her? Or was she just stuck there, replaying that night in 1996 over and over, forever waiting for a ride that would never take her home? I drove back to Vancouver on Sunday, and I took the long route through the Fraser Canyon. I couldn't bring myself to drive the Coquihalla again. Not yet, maybe not ever. But a few weeks later, I was talking to a coworker who'd made the drive to Kamloops recently. I asked him, casually, if he'd seen anything strange on the Coquihalla. He gave me an odd look and said no. Why? I didn't tell him. What would I say? That there's a woman who's been dead for almost 30 years still hitchhiking on that highway? That she gets in your truck and disappears before you reach the rest stop? He'd think I'd lost my mind. But I keep the missing persons poster folded in my glove box now. I printed a copy before I left the station in Merritt. Sometimes, when I'm stopped at a red light or sitting in traffic, I pull it out and look at Sarah Mitchell's face. I wonder what happened to her that night in 1996. I wonder if she knows she's been gone for almost 3 decades, or if time works differently for her now. I wonder if she's scared, or lonely, or angry. And I wonder if she's still standing there on the shoulder of the highway, just past the snowshed summit, waiting in the snow for someone to stop. I haven't driven the Coquihalla since that night. I tell myself it's because the Fraser Canyon route is more scenic, or because I'm trying to avoid winter driving, but I know the real reason. I'm afraid I'll see her again. And I'm afraid that next time, I won't be able to stop myself from pulling over. Because despite everything, despite knowing what happened to me, I still feel like I failed her somehow, like I was supposed to do something, help her in some way, and instead, I just let her disappear. But maybe that's what she wants. Maybe she keeps appearing because she's still trying to get home, still trying to make it to Hope, almost 30 years after she started that journey. Or maybe she's trying to warn us, to show us that some roads are dangerous in ways we don't understand, that some people who disappear never really leave. I don't know, and I don't think I ever will. But I know I'll never forget the way she looked, sitting in my passenger seat with her wet hair and her denim jacket. The way she stared straight ahead, silent and still, like she was already gone. And I know that somewhere on the Coquihalla Highway, in the snow and the darkness, Sarah Mitchell is still waiting. I took the security job at Barkerville Historic Town in the summer of 2017 because I needed money and it sounded easy. Walk around an old ghost town a few times a night, make sure the buildings were locked, keep an eye out for vandals or bears. How hard could it be? The pay was decent, and I'd have the whole night to myself with no one breathing down my neck. I'd worked retail and food service before, so the idea of spending my shifts alone sounded like paradise. Barkerville is about an hour east of Quesnel, tucked into the Caribou Mountains. It's a restored gold rush town from the 1862, the kind of place school groups visit during the day to learn about BC history. During operating hours, it's full of tourists and actors in period costume, blacksmiths demonstrating their craft, staged gunfights in the street. But at night, after the last visitor leaves and the actors go home, it's just empty buildings and wooden boardwalks and the dark forest pressing in on all sides. The site manager, a woman named Carol, gave me the orientation on my first day, showed me which buildings to check, how to work the radio, where the first aid kit was stored. She emphasized that I needed to do a full grounds check every 2 hours. Doors, windows, gates, everything. She said they'd had problems with break-ins before, kids sneaking in to drink or cause trouble. My job was to prevent that. She didn't mention anything else. Nothing about the buildings being weird or the town feeling wrong at night. And for the first few weeks, it was fine. Boring, even. I'd show up at 10 p.m., do my first round, then spend the next 2 hours in the security office reading or watching videos on my phone. The grounds were always empty. The buildings were always locked. Nothing ever happened. Then, about a month in, I started hearing the footsteps. It was a Tuesday night, maybe 2 in the morning. I was doing my rounds, walking down the main street with my flashlight, checking door handles. The boardwalk creaked under my boots, that old wood sound, hollow and loud in the silence. I'd just finished checking the general store when I heard it. Other footsteps, boot heels on wood coming from somewhere behind me. Steady, deliberate steps that echoed between the buildings. I stopped and turned around, shining my flashlight back the way I'd come. The street was empty, no one there. I waited, listening, but the footsteps had stopped too, just the wind moving through the trees and my own breathing. I told myself it was an echo of my own steps, or maybe an animal moving around under the boardwalk. But I knew what I'd heard. Those were boot heels, human footsteps, and they hadn't been mine. I finished my rounds faster than usual that night, checking over my shoulder more than I'd like to admit. When I got back to the office, I radioed Carol just to report that everything was clear. She sounded half asleep when she responded, told me to call if I saw anything unusual. I almost mentioned the footsteps but didn't. What would I say? That I'd heard walking and couldn't find the source? She'd think I was paranoid. The footsteps happened again 2 nights later. Same thing, I'd be walking the grounds, and I'd hear someone else walking nearby, sometimes behind me, sometimes ahead, sometimes parallel to my position on another street. But whenever I'd stop and shine my light, there was nothing, no one. Just empty boardwalks and dark buildings, and that feeling of being watched. I started dreading my rounds. The town felt different at night, heavier somehow, like the air itself was pressing down on you. During the day, with the tourists and the actors and the sunlight, it was quaint and charming. At night, it felt wrong. Those old buildings, restored to look exactly like they had in the 1,860 seconds, stopped feeling like replicas and started feeling like the real thing. Like I'd stepped back in time to when this place was actually alive, when miners and prospectors walked these streets and died in the harsh winters and got buried in the cemetery up the hill. The cemetery. I hadn't thought much about it during my first few weeks, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. There were over 100 graves up there, some with headstones, some just marked with wooden crosses. People who'd lived and died in Barkerville during the gold rush. Children, mostly. The winters were brutal back then, and disease spread fast in the crowded mining camps. I'd walk past the path that led up to the cemetery during my rounds, and I'd feel this pull, like something up there wanted me to visit, but I never did. The cemetery wasn't part of my patrol route, and I wasn't about to go wandering through a graveyard at 2 in the morning for no reason. 3 weeks after the footsteps started, I saw the light. It was a Friday night, clear and cold, the kind of late summer night where you can see your breath. I was doing my 11 p.m. rounds, walking past the old hotel, a 2-story building with a false front and a wooden balcony. During operating hours, it was set up to look like a functioning 1,860 seconds hotel, with period furniture and mannequins dressed in costume. At night, it was just another dark building with too many windows. I was checking the front door when I saw the light in one of the second-floor windows. A warm, flickering glow. Candlelight. I stepped back and stared up at it. The light was coming from the corner room, dancing and wavering like a real candle flame. But that was impossible. The building was locked. There was no electricity. Even if someone had broken in, they'd need to bring their own light source. And who breaks into a historic site to light a candle? I radioed Carol. It took her a minute to respond, and when she did, she sounded annoyed. "What's the problem?" "There's a light in the hotel. Second floor, corner room. Looks like a candle." Silence on the line. Then, "You sure?" "I'm looking at it right now." More silence. Then she said, "It's probably just a reflection. Moonlight or something." I glanced up at the sky. There was no moon, just stars and darkness. "I don't think it's a reflection." She sighed. "Check it out then. If someone broke in, call the RCMP. Otherwise, it's probably nothing." She signed off before I could respond. I stood there staring up at that window, watching the light flicker. Part of me wanted to just leave it, mark it as a reflection in my report, and move on. But I'd seen what I'd seen. And if someone really was inside, I needed to deal with it. The hotel's front door was locked, same as always. I pulled out my keys and let myself in, my flashlight cutting through the darkness of the main lobby. Everything was in place, the antique furniture, the old photographs on the walls, the display cases with mining equipment and period clothing. The air inside smelled like old wood and dust. The stairs to the second floor were on the right side of the lobby, narrow and steep. I stood at the bottom and shined my light up them, listening. No sounds, no movement, just that heavy silence that filled all these old buildings at night. I started climbing. The stairs creaked under my weight, loud and sharp in the quiet. Each step felt like an announcement, like I was telling whatever was up there that I was coming. My heart was beating too fast, and my palms were sweating, despite the cold. I kept telling myself it was nothing, a reflection, like Carol said, or maybe a malfunction with one of the display lights. But I knew those explanations didn't make sense. The second floor was a hallway with rooms on either side, all of them set up to look like functioning hotel rooms from the 1,860 seconds. The corner room was at the far end. The door was open. I stopped at the top of the stairs, my flashlight beam trembling slightly. I could see the light now spilling out into the hallway, that warm, flickering glow. Candlelight, definitely candlelight. I walked down the hall slowly, my boots loud on the old floorboards. When I reached the doorway, I stopped and shined my light inside. The room was small, maybe 12 by 12, with a single bed, a dresser, and a small table by the window. And on that table, right in the center, was a candle, a white taper candle in a brass holder, burning with a steady flame. The wax had melted down about an inch, pooling at the base of the holder. I stood there, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had been in here, recently. They'd lit this candle and left it burning. But how had they gotten in? I'd checked the front door myself, it had been locked. And there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or jimmied locks. I stepped into the room, my light sweeping the space. Everything else looked undisturbed. The bed was made with an old quilt. The dresser drawers were closed. There was a pitcher and wash basin on top of the dresser, both empty and covered in dust. Then I saw the note. It was sitting on the table next to the candle, a piece of paper folded once. My hand shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was old-fashioned, done in black ink, with careful, looping letters. "You shouldn't be here after dark." I read it 3 times, my mouth going dry. The paper felt old, brittle, like it might crumble if I held it too long. The ink had that faded quality you see in documents from 100 years ago, but this couldn't be old. Someone had written this recently. Someone had left it here for me to find. I backed out of the room, still holding the note, and keyed my radio with shaking hands. "Carol, you there?" Static. Then her voice irritated. "What now?" "Someone's been inside the hotel. There's a candle burning in the corner room and a note. You need to call the police." "A note? What does it say?" I read it to her. There was a long pause on the other end. Then she said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Stay in the security office. Don't touch anything else." She hung up before I could respond. I looked back at the room, at that candle still burning on the table, and felt a deep, primal urge to get out of that building. I turned and walked back down the hall, faster than I should have, my boots pounding on the old floorboards. The stairs creaked and groaned under me as I took them 2 at a time. When I burst out the front door into the cold night air, I felt like I'd been holding my breath the entire time. I went back to the security office and waited for Carol. She showed up 40 minutes later, not 20, looking annoyed and half-dressed. She went into the hotel while I waited outside, and when she came back, she was pale. "The candle's out," she said. "What?" "It's out, snuffed, and the note's gone." I stared at her. "That's impossible. I left it on the table. I saw it." "Well, it's not there now." She looked at me like she was trying to decide whether I was lying or crazy. "Are you sure you saw a candle? Are you sure about the note?" I pulled the note out of my pocket and handed it to her. Her expression changed when she saw it, something flickering across her face that might have been recognition or fear. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly. "From the room. I told you. It was sitting next to the candle." She stared at the note for a long time, then folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. "Go home," she said. "Take the rest of the night off. I'll finish your shift." "What? Why?" "Just go home. We'll talk tomorrow." I wanted to argue, but the look on her face stopped me. She was scared. I could see it in the way she held herself, the way she kept glancing back at the hotel. Whatever was going on, she knew more than she was telling me. I didn't go back the next night, or the night after that. I called Carol the following morning and told her I was quitting. She didn't try to talk me out of it, just said she understood and that she'd mail my last paycheck. I never found out who wrote that note or how the candle got lit. I never learned what Carol knew about that place or why she looked so scared when she saw the paper, but I think about it sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. I think about those footsteps I heard echoing through the empty town. I think about that candle burning in the dark, and I think about the note, "You shouldn't be here after dark," like someone was trying to warn me, like someone who'd been there before, back when Barkerville wasn't a restored historic site but a real town full of real people. Someone who knew what walked those boardwalks after the sun went down. I don't know what's in Barkerville at night, and I'm glad I'll never have to find out. I grew up in Kelowna, right on the shore of Okanagan Lake, and like every kid in the valley, I knew about Ogopogo, the lake monster, the serpent, whatever you wanted to call it. There were statues of it downtown, cartoons on tourist t-shirts, boat tours that promised sightings but never delivered anything except disappointed families and wasted money. Most locals treated it as a joke, a gimmick to bring in tourism dollars. Something to laugh about over beers while the outsiders bought their souvenirs and took their selfies. But my grandfather didn't laugh about it. He never did. My grandfather had fished Okanagan Lake for 40 years, starting in the 50s when he first moved to BC from Saskatchewan. He had a small aluminum boat with an outboard motor, and he'd go out almost every morning during the season, checking his nets, bringing in rainbow trout and kokanee salmon. He knew that lake better than anyone I'd ever met, knew where the deep channels ran, where the water turned cold, where the fish congregated depending on the time of year. He could read the surface like some people read books, seeing patterns and signs that were invisible to everyone else. And he swore he'd seen it, not once, 3 times. The first time was in 1972, near Squally Point. He told me the story when I was 12, sitting on his back porch overlooking the water. He'd been checking his nets in the early morning, the lake flat and glassy under a pink sky. He just pulled up a net when he saw something moving beneath the surface about 50 yards out. At first, he thought it was a log or a piece of driftwood, but then it moved with purpose, cutting through the water in a way that driftwood doesn't. He watched it for maybe 2 minutes before it dove and disappeared. He said it was long, at least 20 feet, and serpentine, undulating through the water with smooth, powerful movements. The second time was in 1979, near Rattlesnake Island. Same early morning routine, same calm water. This time, he saw it surface briefly, just the head and part of the neck breaking through about 100 feet from his boat. He described it the same way each time he told the story. A head like a horse, elongated and powerful, dark green and almost black in the dawn light. It had stayed above water for maybe 5 seconds before sinking back down without a splash, like it had never been there at all. But the third time was different. The third time changed him. It was September 1987. I was 7 years old, and my grandfather had been out on the lake alone, checking his nets before sunrise. He came back earlier than usual that morning, and I remember my grandmother looking worried when she saw him pull the boat up onto the shore. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he tied off the mooring line. He didn't talk about it for days, just went quiet, distracted, like something was weighing on him that he couldn't put into words. It was a month later, maybe more, when he finally told my father what had happened. I wasn't supposed to hear it. They were out on the porch, talking in low voices while I was inside, supposedly doing homework. But I pressed my ear against the screen door and listened. He'd been out on the water around 5 in the morning, the sky just starting to lighten in the east. The lake was dead calm, smooth as glass. He'd just finished checking one of his nets when something surfaced beside the boat, not 30 feet away, not 10 feet, right beside it. Close enough that he could have reached out and touched it if he'd been foolish enough to try. He said it was enormous. The part that broke the surface was easily 12 feet long, maybe more, thick around as a telephone pole, dark green, almost black, with a texture like wet leather. And the head, he described it as horse-like, but wrong somehow. Too large, too elongated, with eyes that didn't look like animal eyes. They looked intelligent, aware, like it was thinking. And it had looked at him. Not just glanced in his direction, it had turned its head and looked directly at him, met his eyes. And my grandfather said that in that moment, he felt something he'd never felt before on the water, not in 40 years of fishing. He felt seen, not like an animal looking at a human, but like something old and aware, studying something small and insignificant. He said they stared at each other for maybe 10 seconds, though he admitted it might have been longer. Time felt strange. Then, slowly, deliberately, the thing sank back beneath the surface without making a ripple, just descended straight down into the dark water until it was gone. My grandfather never fished alone after that. He'd take my father or one of his friends with him, always. And on the rare occasions he had to go out by himself, he'd stay close to shore and come back as quickly as possible. He still fished, he loved it too much to stop completely, but something had changed. The lake didn't feel safe anymore, didn't feel like just water and fish, and the peaceful solitude he'd enjoyed for decades. I didn't understand it when I was young. I thought he was just getting old, getting nervous. But as I got older, I started to notice other things. The way he'd stand at the window sometimes, looking out at the lake with an expression I couldn't read. The way he'd go quiet when people made jokes about Ogopogo, his jaw tightening but never saying anything. The way he'd sometimes mutter to himself when he thought no one was listening, words I couldn't quite make out. My grandfather died in 2003, heart attack in his sleep, quick and painless, the way everyone hopes to go. I was 23 by then, living in Vancouver, and I came back for the funeral. After the service, while my grandmother and my parents were dealing with guests, I went into his study, a small room at the back of the house filled with fishing gear and books and old photographs. That's where I found the journal. It was in his desk drawer, underneath some old tackle boxes and maps, a leather-bound notebook, the pages yellowed and filled with his handwriting. I opened it, expecting to find fishing notes or maybe personal reflections. What I found was something else entirely. Pages and pages of notes about sightings. Dates, times, locations, weather conditions. My grandfather had been documenting every report of Ogopogo sightings he could find, going back decades. Some of them were his own. I recognized the 3 encounters he'd told me about, described in careful detail, but there were dozens of others. Reports from fishermen, boaters, people who'd seen something in the lake and told someone about it. He'd collected them all, organized them, looking for patterns. And there were patterns. He'd noticed that most sightings occurred in the early morning or late evening, when the lake was calm, that they clustered in certain areas, Squally Point, Rattlesnake Island, the deep water off Mission Creek, that they seemed to be more frequent in late summer and early fall. He'd drawn maps, marked locations with X's, written notes in the margins about water temperature and depth. It read like a research project, like he'd been trying to prove something, or maybe understand something, and the further I read, the more detailed it became. He'd started documenting the behavior of the thing, how it moved, how it surfaced, how it seemed to watch boats before disappearing. He'd written about the intelligence he'd seen in its eyes that morning in 1987, about the way it had studied him with what he called deliberate curiosity. But it was the last entry that made my hands go cold. It was dated 2 weeks before he died. Just 3 words, written in shaky handwriting that didn't look like his careful script from the earlier pages. It knows my name. That was it. Nothing else. No explanation, no context. Just those 4 words. I stood there in his study, holding that journal, and felt something shift in my chest. A cold, crawling sensation that spread up my spine and settled at the base of my skull. I thought about my grandfather standing at the window, staring out at the lake. I thought about the way he'd gone quiet in his last few years, more withdrawn, like something was weighing on him. And I thought about what he'd told my father about that morning in 1987, about the way the thing had looked at him, studied him, seen him. I took the journal with me when I left. I didn't tell anyone about it, didn't show it to my father or my grandmother. I just packed it in my bag and brought it back to Vancouver, where it sat on my bookshelf for the next 15 years, untouched. I moved back to Kelowna in 2018. Work opportunity, cheaper cost of living, the usual reasons. I bought a small house up on the hillside with a view of the lake. It wasn't until I'd been back for a few months that I remembered the journal. I dug it out of a box in my closet one evening and started reading through it again, looking at my grandfather's careful notes and maps with new eyes. I'd never been much of a fisherman, but I decided to rent a boat one morning and go out onto the lake. I told myself it was just to see what he'd seen, to understand why he'd spent so much time on that water. But I think part of me was looking for it, looking for proof that my grandfather hadn't been crazy, that what he'd documented in that journal was real. I went out early, around 5 in the morning, just like he used to. The lake was calm, the water dark and cold-looking in the pre-dawn light. I motored out to Squally Point, one of the locations he'd marked most frequently in his notes, and cut the engine. Just sat there in the silence, watching the water, waiting. Nothing happened. I sat there for almost 2 hours as the sun came up, and I saw nothing except a few early morning fishermen in the distance and some ducks paddling near the shore. Eventually, I started the motor and headed back, feeling foolish. It was just a lake, just water. Whatever my grandfather had seen, if he'd seen anything at all, it was gone now. But as I was motoring back toward the marina, something made me look over my shoulder. I don't know what, a sound, maybe, or just a feeling, and that's when I saw the wake. It was maybe 200 yards behind me, cutting across the water perpendicular to my path. A V-shaped wake, the kind you see behind a boat, except there was no boat, no kayak, no swimmer, nothing visible creating it. Just the wake itself, moving fast and steady across the calm surface. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds before it disappeared, the water smoothing back to glass like nothing had disturbed it. I sat there with my hand on the throttle, my heart pounding, and thought about my grandfather's journal. Thought about the patterns he documented, the sightings, the behavior. Thought about that morning in 1987 when something had surfaced beside his boat and looked at him with intelligent eyes. I haven't been back on the lake since. I still live in the house on the hillside, still look out at the water every morning. But I don't go out there, don't even go down to the shore anymore. Because I keep thinking about that last entry in my grandfather's journal. It knows my name. And I keep thinking about the fact that I have his name. Same first and last name, passed down through 3 generations. I'm named after him, which means if it knew his name, it might know mine too. Sometimes, late at night, I stand at my window and look down at the lake. The water's usually calm, dark, and glassy under the moonlight, and sometimes not often, but sometimes I see something moving out there, a shape just beneath the surface, long and serpentine, cutting through the water with smooth, deliberate movements. I tell myself it's a log, or a boat in the distance, or just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But I don't believe that, and I don't think my grandfather believed it either. There's something in Okanagan Lake, something old, something that watches. And for reasons I don't understand, it knew my grandfather, knew his name, studied him that morning in 1987, and decided he was worth remembering. I don't know if it's seen me yet, don't know if it's marked me the way it marked him, but I think about it every time I look at that water, and I keep my grandfather's journal locked in my desk drawer, where I don't have to see those last 4 words unless I go looking for them. It knows my name. I hope to God it doesn't know mine. I went to Whistler in March 2021 for a solo hiking trip. 3 days alone in the backcountry, just me and my tent and the kind of silence you can't find in the city. I'd been planning it for months, saving up vacation days at work, mapping out trails, checking weather forecasts. After a year of lockdowns and Zoom calls and staring at the same 4 walls, I needed to get out, needed to clear my head. So I loaded up my car with camping gear and drove up the Sea to Sky Highway on a Friday morning, windows down, music loud, feeling like I was finally doing something right. The plan was simple: park at the Cheakamus Lake trailhead, hike in about 5 kilometers to a designated camping area, spend 2 nights there, then hike back out on Sunday. Easy route, well marked, nothing technical. I'd done harder trips before. I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, a satellite communicator in case something went wrong. I'd told my roommate where I was going and when I'd be back. Everything by the book. I remember the hike in. It was late afternoon, the light filtering through the old-growth forest in dusty golden shafts. The trail was muddy from recent rain, but passable. I passed a few other hikers heading out, a couple in their 50s, a guy with a dog, and we exchanged the usual pleasantries. The forest smelled like wet cedar and earth. My pack was heavy but manageable. I felt good, alive, like I was exactly where I needed to be. I reached the lake around 5:30 and found a spot to camp near the shore. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the mountains and trees like glass. I set up my tent, filtered some water, made dinner on my camp stove, pasta with canned sauce. Nothing fancy. I sat on a log and watched the sun set behind the peaks, turning the sky pink and orange and purple. It was beautiful, perfect, exactly what I'd been hoping for. I remember going to sleep that night. I remember zipping myself into my sleeping bag, checking my phone one last time, full battery, no service, expected, and closing my eyes. The ground was hard beneath me, and I could hear the wind moving through the trees. I remember thinking how quiet it was, how peaceful. Then I woke up in my car, not in my tent, not at the lake. In my car, sitting in the driver's seat, parked outside a Tim Hortons in Squamish. The sun was up, bright and harsh through the windshield. My keys were in the ignition. My seatbelt was buckled. I was wearing clean clothes, jeans, and a hoodie I'd packed but hadn't put on yet. I sat there, disoriented, trying to figure out what had happened. Had I driven here in my sleep? Had I gotten sick and decided to leave early? But I felt fine, not tired, not hungry, not sore, just confused. I checked the clock on the dashboard, 8:47 a.m. Then I looked at my phone. The date said it was March 23rd, 8 days after I'd gone to sleep at Cheakamus Lake. 8 days. I stared at the screen, my heart starting to pound. That wasn't possible. I'd left for the trip on March 12th. Today was supposed to be March 15th, Monday morning. the day I was supposed to hike back out and drive home. But according to my phone, it was the 23rd, more than a week later. I opened my calendar app, my messages, my email. Everything said March 23rd. I had missed calls from my roommate, from my boss, from my parents, text messages asking where I was, if I was okay, why I hadn't come back to work. My boss had left a voicemail saying I'd been marked as a no-show for 4 days straight and asking me to call him as soon as possible. I sat there trying to make sense of it, trying to remember anything after falling asleep in my tent, but there was nothing, just a blank space where 8 days should have been. I checked my gear. My backpack was in the trunk, neatly packed, everything in its place. My tent was rolled up properly. My sleeping bag was clean and dry. Even my camp stove was wiped down and stowed correctly. Everything looked like I'd packed it carefully, deliberately, not like I'd been sick or injured or panicking. I checked my body. No cuts, no bruises, no signs of injury. My clothes were clean. I wasn't sunburned or windburned. I didn't feel dehydrated or exhausted. I felt fine, better than fine actually, rested, like I'd been sleeping well for days. But I had no memory of it, nothing. Just that jump from falling asleep at the lake to waking up in my car outside a coffee shop in Squamish. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got back to Vancouver, my roommate nearly tackled me at the door. He'd been calling the RCMP, filing a missing persons report, checking hospitals. He said I'd been gone for 11 days total, not 8 I'd left on the 12th, and today was the 23rd. He'd driven up to the trailhead himself after I didn't come back on the 15th, but my car was already gone from the parking lot. I tried to explain that I didn't remember anything, that I'd somehow lost 8 days. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, asked if I'd hit my head, if I'd been doing drugs, if I'd had some kind of mental break. I told him no, none of that, I just didn't remember. He made me promise to see a doctor. I went the next day. The doctor ran tests, blood work, CT scan, neurological exam. Everything came back normal. No signs of head trauma, no drugs in my system, no medical explanation for the memory loss. She suggested it might be psychological, maybe a dissociative episode brought on by stress. She referred me to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist asked me about my mental health, my stress levels, whether I'd been experiencing anxiety or depression. I told her I'd been stressed, sure, but nothing extreme, nothing that would explain losing 8 days of my life. She prescribed medication for anxiety and suggested we continue sessions to work through what might have triggered the episode. But I didn't think it was psychological. Because of what I found on my phone, I'd been checking it obsessively since I woke up in the car, looking for clues, anything that might tell me what happened during those missing days. I'd found the bank transactions pretty quickly, 2 charges for gas, one at a Shell station in Pemberton on March 16th, another at a Chevron in Squamish on March 19th. A charge for groceries at a Save-On Foods in Squamish on March 18th. The amounts were small, normal. Nothing strange about them except that I had no memory of making any of those purchases. But then I found the photos. There were dozens of them in my camera roll, all taken between March 15th and March 22nd. The timestamps were spread out over the 8 missing days, 2 or 3 photos per day. Most of them were landscapes, trees, mountains, trails, lakes. Beautiful shots, well composed, the kind of photos I'd normally take on a hiking trip, but I didn't recognize any of the locations. They weren't from Cheakamus Lake. They weren't from any trail I knew. I went through them slowly, studying each one, trying to trigger a memory. Nothing. They were just photos of places I'd apparently been but couldn't remember. Different forests, different mountains, different bodies of water. Some of them looked like they were taken at higher elevations, above the tree line. Others were deep in old-growth forest. A few were taken at night, the flash illuminating tree trunks and undergrowth. And then I reached the last photo. It was me. A selfie, taken with my arm extended, my face visible in the frame. I was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground dropping away behind me into empty space. Mountains visible in the far distance. My expression was neutral, almost blank. I was wearing the same hoodie I'd woken up in, my hair messy, a slight sunburn on my face. But I wasn't alone in the photo. Behind me, maybe 10 feet back, barely visible in the shadows where the trees started, was another figure, tall, taller than me by at least a foot. The resolution wasn't good enough to make out details, but I could see the shape of a person standing there, watching, just standing, not moving. The way the shadows fell across them made it impossible to see their face or clothing. Just a dark silhouette, human-shaped, but somehow wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I stared at that photo for a long time, zooming in, trying to see more. But the image quality degraded when I zoomed, turning into pixels and artifacts. All I could make out was the basic shape, tall, thin, standing motionless in the shadows while I smiled blankly at the camera. I didn't remember taking that photo, didn't remember being at that cliff, didn't remember meeting anyone during those missing 8 days. I started trying to identify the location, spent hours going through trail maps, satellite images, hiking forums. I posted the photo on Reddit, asking if anyone recognized the cliff or the mountains in the background. A few people suggested possible areas: the Chief in Squamish, trails near Garibaldi, alpine routes near Whistler. But when I drove out to check those locations, none of them matched. The rock face was different, the angle wrong, the mountains in the distance not aligned correctly. I went back to Chicamas Lake, thinking maybe I could retrace my steps, find some clue about what happened after I fell asleep that first night. But the area looked exactly like I remembered it. My campsite was gone, of course, any trace of me, long since erased by other campers and the elements. I hiked around the lake, checking other trails, looking for anything familiar from the photos on my phone. Nothing matched. I called the RCMP and reported it, told them about the missing time, the photos, the figure in the last image. The officer was polite but skeptical, asked if I'd been drinking or using substances, asked if I had any history of mental illness. I told him no, showed him the medical reports from my doctor saying I was fine. He took my statement but didn't seem particularly concerned. Said memory loss after head trauma was common, even though I hadn't had head trauma, and that the figure in the photo was probably just another hiker I'd met and forgotten about. But I know what I saw in that photo, and it wasn't just another hiker. It's been over 2 years now. The missing 8 days are still gone. I've tried hypnosis, therapy, everything. Nothing brings back the memories. My bank statements show I bought gas and groceries. My phone shows I took photos across a wide area of the Whistler backcountry, but I have no conscious memory of any of it. Sometimes I look at that last photo, zoomed in on the figure in the shadows, and I wonder who they were, what they wanted, why I was standing at the edge of a cliff with them behind me, close enough to push me if they'd wanted to. And I wonder what else happened during those 8 days. What I did, where I went, who I met, whether the lack of memory is a blessing or a curse. I haven't gone hiking alone since. Haven't gone back to Whistler. I tell people it's because I'm busy with work, or because I'm hiking with friends now, or because I've taken up other hobbies. But the truth is simpler. I'm afraid of what might happen if I go back, afraid I might lose another week, afraid I might wake up somewhere else with no memory of how I got there, afraid I might meet whoever was standing behind me in that photo, and this time I might remember. Or worse, that I won't. I've been a forestry technician for 12 years. My job is to assess old-growth forests across British Columbia, documenting tree species, measuring diameters and heights, determining whether stands should be protected for conservation or opened up for selective logging. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. Most days, I'm alone in the forest with my equipment, my GPS, and my thoughts. I've seen some of the most beautiful wilderness in the province, ancient cedars that were saplings when the Roman Empire fell, hemlock groves so dense the forest floor stays dark even at noon, stands of Douglas fir that tower 200 feet into the sky. I thought I'd seen everything these forests had to offer, but last September, I encountered something near Tofino that I still can't explain. I was sent to survey a stand of old-growth Sitka spruce about 40 kilometers inland from the coast, accessible only by logging road and then a 3-kilometer hike through dense bush. The area had been flagged for potential conservation status, which meant documenting every significant tree, taking core samples to determine age, assessing the ecological value of the stand. It was supposed to be a 2-day job: hike in, set up camp, do the survey, hike out. The trees were extraordinary. Sitka spruce can live for centuries in the right conditions, and these were some of the oldest I'd ever seen. Massive trunks, some of them 6 feet in diameter or more, their bark thick and deeply furrowed. The canopy was so dense that even in September, with the sun directly overhead, the forest floor was draped in shadow. Everything was covered in moss, the ground, the fallen logs, even the lower branches of the living trees. It felt primordial, like stepping back 1,000 years to when this entire coast was unbroken wilderness. I set up my base camp in a small clearing near a creek and spent the first day doing preliminary mapping, flagging the largest specimens with colored tape and marking their locations on my GPS. The work was straightforward but time-consuming. Each tree needed to be measured, photographed, and assessed for signs of disease or damage. By late afternoon, I documented maybe 30 trees out of what I estimated were several hundred in the stand. The next morning, I headed deeper into the grove to survey the interior sections. The forest was silent except for the occasional bird call and the soft sound of wind moving through the canopy far overhead. The moss absorbed sound, making my footsteps almost noiseless. It was peaceful, in the way only deep wilderness can be. No human noise, no machinery, no voices. Just the ancient quiet of old-growth forest. I was measuring a particularly large specimen. My diameter tape said it was almost 7 feet across when I heard it, a sound coming from somewhere nearby. At first, I thought it was wind, or maybe a distant chainsaw from one of the active logging operations farther west. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't either of those things. It sounded like screaming. Not animal screaming. I'd heard enough of that over the years to recognize the difference. Bears, cougars, ravens, they all make sounds that can be mistaken for human voices if you don't know what you're hearing. But this was different. This sounded human, a muffled, desperate sound, like someone crying out from a great distance or through heavy insulation. I stopped what I was doing and turned slowly, trying to pinpoint the direction. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, maybe 50 meters away. I grabbed my radio, thinking maybe another technician or a logging crew was in the area and someone was hurt. But when I keyed the mic, all I got was static. Radio signals were always spotty this deep in the mountains, and the dense canopy didn't help. I started walking toward the sound, moving carefully through the moss and undergrowth. As I got closer, I realized something strange. The sound wasn't moving. It was stationary, coming from one fixed point, and it was getting louder, more distinct. I could hear the desperation in it now, the raw quality of someone in genuine distress. Then I found the source. It was a tree, a massive Sitka spruce, easily one of the largest in the stand, its trunk rising straight and true before branching out high overhead. The sound was coming from the tree itself, not from around it or behind it, but from inside it, from within the trunk. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The screaming was clearer now, almost like someone trapped inside a confined space, their voice muffled by layers of wood. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes fading to a desperate whimper, sometimes intensifying to a shriek that made my skin crawl. I approached slowly and pressed my ear against the bark. The sound was louder there, more immediate, and I could hear something else, words. Whoever was making that sound was trying to say something, though I couldn't make out what. The words were distorted, stretched, like they were being filtered through something that warped them beyond recognition. My first thought was that there was a hollow cavity in the trunk, a space created by rot or insect damage, and somehow wind or water was moving through it in a way that created this sound. I'd encountered plenty of hollow trees before, and they could make strange noises. But this didn't sound like wind. It sounded exactly like a human voice. I pulled out my radio again and tried to raise my supervisor. This time, I got through, though the signal was weak and filled with static. I explained where I was and what I was hearing, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. He listened without interrupting, then said what I'd expected him to say, probably whine through a hollow cavity. You know how weird old-growth trees can sound. I know, I said, but this is different. It really sounds like someone screaming. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you want me to send someone out there? Could take a couple days to arrange. I looked at the tree, listening to that muffled, desperate sound. Part of me wanted to say yes, wanted backup, wanted someone else to witness this and confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But another part of me, the professional part, knew how this would sound. A forestry tech calling in backup because a tree was making noise. No, I said finally. I'll mark it and document it. Finish the survey and head back tomorrow. We can decide what to do from there. All right, tag it as a priority. We'll take a closer look when you're done. I signed off and marked the tree with bright orange flagging tape, noting its GPS coordinates and taking several photographs. I pressed my hand against the bark one more time, feeling the rough texture under my palm. The screaming had faded to a low, continuous sound, not quite crying, but something close. It made my chest feel tight, like I was listening to something I shouldn't be able to hear. He left. Finished the rest of my survey, cataloging trees and taking measurements, but I couldn't focus properly. My mind kept drifting back to that sound, to the way it had sounded so human, so desperate. When I made camp that night, I could still hear it faintly in the distance, carried on the wind through the trees. I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again, that muffled screaming, that wordless plea, and I kept thinking about the words I'd almost been able to make out when I pressed my ear against the bark. What had it been trying to say? I left the next morning, earlier than planned, and made the drive back to the regional office. I filed my report, noting the unusual acoustic phenomenon I'd encountered and recommending further investigation. My supervisor scheduled a follow-up visit for 2 days later, me and a 3-person team including a biologist and 2 other technicians. We drove back out on a Thursday morning, taking the same route I'd taken alone. When we reached the end of the logging road, I led them on the 3-kilometer hike to the stand, retracing my path through the bush. My GPS led us straight to the coordinates I'd marked, but when we arrived, the tree was gone. Not cut down, not fallen, just gone. I stood in the spot where it should have been, checking my GPS over and over, certain I'd made a mistake. But the coordinates were right. I was standing exactly where I'd marked that tree 2 days earlier. There was the creek I'd used as a landmark. There was the unusual lightning-scarred cedar 20 meters to the east. Everything else was exactly where it should have been, except the tree. There was no stump, no sawdust, no disturbance in the moss where something that massive should have left evidence of removal. The forest floor looked undisturbed, the moss intact, the undergrowth growing naturally. It was as if the tree had simply vanished, leaving no trace of ever having existed. The biologist, a woman named Dr. Chen, was examining the area carefully, looking for any sign of recent activity. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" she asked. I showed her the GPS coordinates, the photographs on my camera. "This is it. That tree was right here." One of the other technicians, a guy named Marcus, was walking the perimeter, checking surrounding trees. "There's no way to remove a tree that size without heavy equipment," he said. "And you'd see the tracks, you'd see the damage to surrounding vegetation. There's nothing here." Dr. Chen was crouched down, examining something in the moss. "Come look at this," she said quietly. I walked over and knelt beside her. She'd brushed away a layer of moss to reveal the soil underneath. And there, scratched into the dark earth, was a single word: Dakin. The letters were rough, carved with something sharp, maybe a stick or a rock. The word was maybe 8 inches long, the letters uneven but clearly deliberate. Someone or something had scratched this into the ground recently. The moss around it had been disturbed, pulled aside to expose the soil. "Did you do this?" Dr. Chen asked me. "No, I've never seen this before." She took photographs, documenting the word from multiple angles. Then she stood up and looked around the clearing, her expression troubled. "This doesn't make any sense," she said. "A tree that size has been here for centuries. It doesn't just disappear. And even if someone cut it down illegally, which would be insane given the location and conservation status, you'd see evidence. You can't hide the removal of a 700-year-old tree." We searched the area for another hour, looking for any explanation. We found nothing. No stumps, no drag marks, no signs of machinery or human activity beyond my own footprints from 2 days earlier and the words scratched into the soil. The team documented everything, took soil samples and photographs, and eventually we hiked back out. The official report listed it as an anomaly requiring further investigation, but I could tell no one knew what to make of it. Dr. Chen suggested that maybe I'd been mistaken about the location, that the tree I'd marked was actually somewhere else in the stand. But I knew better. I double-checked my coordinates. That tree had been exactly where I said it was, and now it was gone. The word "taken" bothered me more than the missing tree. Someone or something had left that message. But who and when? I'd been the only person in that area for days. And even if someone else had been there, some illegal logger or vandal, why would they leave a message? Why not just take the tree and say nothing? I went back alone 3 weeks later, without telling anyone. I wanted to see the spot again, to confirm what I'd seen, to make sure I hadn't imagined or misremembered something. When I reached the coordinates, the forest looked exactly as it had during our team visit. No tree, no stump, just the moss-covered forest floor, and the word still faintly visible where we'd uncovered it. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the canopy overhead. And then, faintly, I heard it again. That sound, not from the same spot the tree was gone, but from somewhere deeper in the forest. Muffled screaming, desperate and distant, coming from within another trunk. I didn't go looking for it. I turned around and walked back to my vehicle, faster than I should have, my heart pounding. I haven't been back to that stand since, marked it as surveyed, recommended conservation status, and moved on to other sites. But I think about it sometimes, about that sound, that voice trapped inside ancient wood, about the words scratched into the soil, taken, not cut, not fallen, not removed, taken. I wonder how many other trees in that forest hold the same thing. How many voices are trapped inside bark and heartwood, screaming to be heard. And I wonder what takes them, what reaches into the earth and pulls centuries-old giants out of existence, leaving nothing behind but moss and silence. I don't know if I want to find out, but sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear it, that muffled, desperate sound, and I wonder if one day, someone will press their ear against a tree and hear my voice screaming back at them from inside the wood. I take the BC Ferries route from Sawasan to Swartz Bay at least twice a month for work. I'm a consultant, and I have clients on Vancouver Island that I visit regularly. After 5 years of making the trip, you get to know the routine. You know which ships run, which routes, which sailings are busiest, where to sit to avoid the crowds. You know the 9 p.m. departure gets you to Swartz Bay by 11, just in time to drive into Victoria and crash at your hotel before early morning meetings. It becomes automatic, predictable, safe. But last October, I boarded a ferry I'd never seen before. It was a Wednesday night, and I'd had a long day of meetings in Vancouver. I was tired, running on coffee and not much else, and I just wanted to get to the island, check into my hotel, and sleep. I arrived at Sawasan Terminal around 8:30, bought my ticket at the kiosk, and drove down to the holding lanes. Everything was normal. The digital signs showed the 9 p.m. sailing to Swartz Bay on schedule. The usual lineup of cars and trucks waiting to board. The attendants in their yellow vests directing traffic. When they started loading, I followed the flow of vehicles onto the car deck. That's when I noticed something was off. The ship looked different, older. The paint on the hull was faded and rust-stained, the kind of wear you see on vessels that have been in service too long without proper maintenance. The lights on the car deck were dimmer than usual, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. But I figured it was just a replacement ship, maybe an older vessel they'd pulled in to cover for one of the regular ferries being serviced. It happens sometimes. I parked, grabbed my laptop bag, and headed up the stairs to the passenger deck. The stairwell was narrow and poorly lit, the metal steps echoing under my feet. When I emerged onto the main passenger level, I stopped and looked around, trying to get my bearings. The deck was nearly empty, maybe a dozen people scattered across the rows of seats, all of them sitting alone, staring out the windows at the dark water. No families, no groups of friends, no one talking or looking at their phones. Just isolated figures in that dim yellow light, motionless and silent. I walked toward the cafeteria, thinking I'd grab a sandwich and find a quiet spot to sit. The ship's engines rumbled to life beneath my feet, and I felt us start to move away from the terminal. Through the windows, I could see the lights of Sawasan fading into the distance. Normal departure. Everything seemed fine except for the strange emptiness and the old condition of the ship. The cafeteria was closed. Not just closed for the night, but actually shuttered metal gates pulled down over the counter. No lights on inside, no staff. I stood there staring at it, confused. The cafeteria was always open on the evening sailings. People needed food, coffee, something to keep them awake during the crossing. But this one was dark and locked tight. I looked around for an information desk or a crew member I could ask about it. The ship felt wrong now, not just old but actively unsettling. The lighting was too dim, throwing long shadows across the empty seats. The windows were fogged with condensation, making it hard to see outside. And there was a smell, salt and rust, and something else I couldn't identify. Something stale and organic. I walked through the passenger deck, looking for someone in a BC Ferries uniform. Most of the other passengers didn't even look up as I passed. They just sat there, staring out at the black water, their faces slack and expressionless. One man was rocking slowly back and forth in his seat. A woman near the back had her hands pressed flat against the window, her breath fogging the glass. I finally found a crew member in what should have been the gift shop, but was now just an empty room with bare shelves. She was a woman in her 50s, wearing a faded BC Ferries uniform that looked at least a decade out of date. She was standing in the corner, her back to me, perfectly still. "Excuse me," I said, "is the cafeteria going to open? And do you know why the ship is so empty?" She turned around slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and distant. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking, like she was trying to remember how to form words. "You shouldn't be on this sailing," she finally said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. I blinked. "What? I have a ticket. I boarded with everyone else." "You shouldn't be here." She said it again, exactly the same way, like a recording. Then she turned back around, facing the corner, and went still again. A cold feeling started spreading through my chest. I backed out of the room and headed toward the main stairs, thinking I'd go back down to the car deck and wait this out in my vehicle. Whatever was happening on this ship, I didn't want any part of it. That's when the PA system crackled to life. The sound was distorted, wrong, like someone speaking through water or static. The voice that came through was deep and slow, each word stretched out until it barely sounded human. "We are not going to Swartz Bay." I stopped dead in the middle of the passenger deck. The other people, the ones sitting and staring, didn't react at all, didn't move, didn't look up, just kept staring out at the darkness. I ran to the nearest door that led out to the outer deck. I needed air, needed to see where we were going, needed to confirm that this was just some weird announcement error. But when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't turn. The door was locked. I tried the next one, locked. I ran down the length of the ship, trying every door I passed. All of them are locked. I pulled out my phone to call someone, my colleague on the island, my wife, anyone, but there was no signal, not even emergency calls, just a blank screen where the bars should have been, and no Wi-Fi. The usual BC Ferries Wi-Fi network that was always available wasn't showing up at all. I went back to the windows and pressed my face against the glass, trying to see out through the condensation. We were moving, that much was clear. I could feel the engines thrumming through the deck and see the white foam of our wake in the dark water. But I couldn't see any lights, no coastal towns, no other ships. Just endless black water and the faint outline of mountains against an even blacker sky. The crossing from Sawasan to Swartz Bay usually takes about an hour and a half. 2 hours maximum if the seas are rough. I checked my watch. We'd been sailing for 45 minutes. We should have been halfway there. But when I looked out the window, I couldn't see any of the usual landmarks. No lights from the Gulf Islands. No glow from Victoria in the distance. Just darkness. I walked back through the passenger deck, looking for someone, anyone, who might be able to tell me what was happening. The other passengers were still sitting in their isolated spots, staring out at nothing. I approached one of them, a middle-aged man in a business suit. "Excuse me," I said, touching his shoulder lightly. He didn't respond, didn't even blink, just kept staring. I tried another passenger, a younger woman with her hair pulled back. Same result. It was like they were there but not there, their bodies present but their minds somewhere else entirely. I went back to the gift shop room where I'd found the attendant. She was still standing in the corner, motionless. I called out to her, but she didn't turn around. I walked closer, close enough to see that she wasn't breathing. Not that she was dead, her eyes were open, her body upright, but her chest wasn't moving. She was perfectly, unnaturally still. My heart was pounding now, my breath coming fast and shallow. I ran back to the stairs and down to the car deck, thinking if I couldn't get off the ship, at least I could wait in my car, lock the doors, ride out whatever this was until we reached land. The car deck was darker than I remembered. The overhead lights were mostly out, leaving pools of shadow between the parked vehicles. My car was near the middle, and I hurried toward it, my footsteps echoing off the metal walls. That's when I realized there were more vehicles than there should have been. The car deck had been maybe a third full when we loaded, but now it was packed. Cars and trucks and vans crammed into every available space, some of them parked at odd angles like they'd been placed there hastily. And they were old. Not just a few years old, but decades old. I saw a station wagon from the 70s, a pickup truck with rust eating through the wheel wells, a sedan with a license plate format that hadn't been used in BC since the 80s. I reached my car and pulled on the handle, locked. I dug in my pocket for my keys, hands shaking, and finally got the door open. I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my breath coming in gasps. I sat there trying to calm down, trying to think rationally. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the terminal and this was a dream. Maybe I'd been drugged somehow and was hallucinating. None of those explanations made sense, but they were better than the alternative that I'd somehow boarded a ship that wasn't real, that wasn't going where it was supposed to go. I looked at my watch. We'd been sailing for 2 hours now, well past when we should have arrived at Swartz Bay. I pressed my face against the car window and looked out at the other vehicles on the car deck. In the dim light, I could see that some of them weren't empty. There were people sitting in them, visible through the windows, but they weren't moving, just sitting there in the dark, perfectly still, like the passengers upstairs. The ship's engines changed pitch. We were slowing down. I felt the ferry begin to turn, and through the window, I could see lights approaching. We were coming into a dock, but not Swartz Bay. The terminal I could see through the darkness wasn't the modern, well-lit facility I knew. This was something older, smaller, a concrete dock with a few dim lights and a single building that looked abandoned. No other ferries. No cars waiting. Just an empty, deteriorating terminal that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The ferry bumped against the dock, and I heard the sounds of the car deck ramp being lowered. The overhead lights flickered and then brightened slightly, and I saw the vehicles around me start their engines. One by one, those old cars and trucks began to move, driving toward the ramp and off the ship. I didn't start my engine. I just sat there, watching them go, trying to decide what to do. Should I follow them off, or stay on the ship and hope it would take me back to somewhere I recognized? The decision was made for me. My car engine turned on by itself. I hadn't turned the key, hadn't touched anything, but the engine rumbled to life, and my car began to move forward, steering itself toward the ramp. I grabbed the wheel, tried to stop it, but it wouldn't respond to my input. The brake pedal was stiff under my foot, useless. The car drove itself off the ferry, following the others onto the concrete dock. As soon as my wheels hit land, control returned. The car stopped moving on its own, the engine still running but responding to me again. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, then looked in my rearview mirror. The ferry was already pulling away. No announcement, no crew on deck supervising departure. Just the old rust-stained ship backing away from the dock, turning and heading back out into the dark water. I put my car in park and got out, looking around. The other vehicles were gone, vanished into the darkness beyond the terminal. I was alone at an abandoned ferry dock that I didn't recognize, somewhere on an island that might or might not be Vancouver Island. It took me 4 hours to find a road, another 3 to find a town I recognized, Campbell River, about 150 kilometers north of where I should have arrived. I drove straight to the nearest hotel, checked in, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed with all the lights on, trying to make sense of what had happened. I reported it the next day, called BC Ferries, told them about the ship, the empty passenger deck, the locked doors, the wrong destination. The person on the phone was polite but confused. They said all their vessels had run on schedule the night before. The 9 p.m. sailing from Tsawwassen to Swartz Bay had departed and arrived normally. They had no record of any issues, no reports of wrong vessels or route deviations. I've made the crossing a dozen times since then, always during the day now, never at night. And I always check the ship carefully before I board, looking at the paint, the lights, the condition of the vessel, making sure it's one of the regular ferries, not something older, not something that shouldn't be there. But sometimes, when I'm driving to Tsawwassen in the evening and I see the ferries lit up at the terminal, I think about that ship, about where it came from, about where it was really going, about the people sitting in the darkness, staring out at nothing. And I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, sailing routes that don't exist on any schedule, carrying passengers to destinations that aren't on any map. I wonder if I'll see it again. And I hope to God I don't. I've been hiking Grouse Mountain for most of my adult life. I know the main trails, the Grouse Grind, the BCMC, the backcountry routes that take you away from the tourists and up into the real wilderness. But in October 2018, During a solo hike on one of the less traveled paths near the north side of the mountain, I found something I'd never seen before. An old ranger station, abandoned and hidden so deep in the trees that you'd walk right past it if you weren't paying attention. I'd gone off trail slightly, following what looked like an old service road that had been reclaimed by the forest. The path was overgrown but still visible beneath the moss and ferns, winding through dense hemlock and cedar. I was maybe 2 hours into my hike, well away from any marked routes, when I saw the building through the trees. It was small, maybe 20 by 30 feet, built from weathered wood that had turned gray with age. The windows were intact but filmed with decades of grime. The roof sagged in the middle but hadn't collapsed. There was a small, covered porch at the front with a bench and what looked like an old axe leaning against the wall. Everything about it screamed abandonment, but in a preserved way, like the forest had decided to leave it alone rather than reclaim it completely. I approached slowly, that natural caution you develop when encountering structures in the wilderness. Could be used by squatters, could be structurally unsound, could be home to animals, but as I got closer, I saw that everything looked undisturbed. The windows weren't broken, the door hung straight on its hinges. Even the small woodpile beside the porch was still neatly stacked, though the logs had long since rotted through. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open carefully, and it swung inward without resistance, the hinges surprisingly silent. Inside was a single room set up as a basic ranger station. There was a desk against one wall with an old radio set, the kind with vacuum tubes and analog dials. A filing cabinet stood in the corner. A cot with a sleeping bag still on it sat against the opposite wall. And on the desk, right in the center, was a coffee mug, half empty or half full, with the residue of old coffee dried to a dark stain at the bottom. The air inside smelled stale but not moldy, just old, like a room that had been sealed for a long time. I stood in the doorway, taking it all in, trying to understand what I was looking at. This was clearly an old BC Parks ranger station, the kind they used to maintain in remote areas for fire watch and trail patrol, but it had been abandoned, left with everything still in place, like whoever had been here had just stepped out for a moment and never come back. I walked over to the desk. Papers were scattered across the surface, work logs, weather reports, maintenance schedules, all of them dated 1983. The handwriting was neat and precise, noting daily temperatures, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, routine stuff, normal ranger work. Then I noticed the calendar hanging on the wall above the desk. It was one of those tearaway calendars, the kind where you rip off a page each day. It was stopped on the 15th of October 1983, a Friday. There were no notes on that day's page, nothing to indicate why the calendar had stopped there. I took out my phone and started taking photos. I photographed the desk, the radio equipment, the coffee mug, the calendar. I took wide shots of the whole interior and close-ups of details, the papers on the desk, the sleeping bag on the cot, the old Park Service jacket hanging on a hook by the door. This was historical, I thought. This was something BC Parks would want to know about, something that should be documented and maybe even preserved. I spent maybe 20 minutes in that station, looking through drawers and filing cabinets, finding nothing but more routine paperwork from 1983. No personal effects, no photos, no clues about who had staffed this place or why it had been abandoned so completely. Just the work logs and the equipment and that half-empty coffee mug sitting on the desk like someone had put it down meaning to come back for it. Before I left, I stood at the window and looked out at the forest. The trees pressed close on all sides, dense and dark. You couldn't see far in any direction, just that wall of green and shadow. I imagined what it must have been like to work here, to spend days or weeks alone in this isolated station with nothing but the radio for contact with the outside world. I left the door open, it had been unlocked when I found it, and made my way back to the main trail. The hike out felt longer than the hike in, and I kept thinking about that station, about the stopped calendar and the abandoned coffee. When I got home that evening, I went through the photos on my phone, examining each one, trying to understand what I'd found. That's when I decided to post about it online. I uploaded the photos to a BC hiking forum with a description of the location as best as I could describe it, and asked if anyone knew anything about the station. I figured someone with knowledge of Park's history might be able to tell me when it had been in operation and why it had been abandoned. The responses came in over the next few days. Most people were fascinated, saying they'd hiked Grouse Mountain for years and never knew there was an old ranger station up there. A few offered theories about when it might have been built and why it was no longer in use. The usual conversation. Then, 4 days after I posted, someone left a comment that made my stomach drop. The username was something generic, BC Ranger 72, and the comment was brief but specific. I worked at that station, summer of '83. It was shut down after Tom disappeared. He was the last ranger assigned there. Radioed in one night saying he saw lights moving through the trees. Transmission cut out mid-sentence. We found the station empty the next morning. Never found Tom. Place was decommissioned after that. I stared at that comment for a long time, reading it over and over. Then I went back through my photos, looking at them with new context. The coffee mug, the papers dated October 1983. The calendar stopped on October 15th. If what this person was saying was true, then that coffee mug might have been Tom's. Those papers might have been the last logs he filed, and that date on the calendar might have been the day he disappeared. I tried to respond to the comment, asking for more details, but BC Ranger 72 never replied. The account looked newly created, with no post history beyond that single comment. I checked back daily for a week, but they never posted again. The whole thing bothered me more than it should have. I kept thinking about that ranger station, about Tom radioing in, about lights in the trees and then vanishing, about the station sitting there for 35 years, perfectly preserved, with his coffee still on the desk. And I kept looking at my photos, zooming in on details, trying to see if there was anything I'd missed. A week after finding the station, I decided to go back. I wanted to see it again, maybe take more photos, maybe find some clue about what had happened to Tom. I knew roughly where it was off the north side of the mountain, along that overgrown service road. I figured I could find it again. I set out on a Saturday morning, retracing my route from the previous week. I found the spot where I'd left the main trail, found the old service road cutting through the trees. I followed it for what felt like the right distance, looking for the station through the forest. But I couldn't find it. I walked the length of that road 3 times, checking GPS coordinates on my phone, looking for any sign of the building, but there was nothing. Just trees and undergrowth and the overgrown path disappearing into the forest. No ranger station. No weathered wood building with a sagging roof. Nothing. I even found what I thought was the exact spot. I recognized a distinctive lightning-struck cedar nearby, and the topography matched what I remembered. But where the station should have been, there were only trees. Old trees, their trunks thick with moss, their roots deep and undisturbed. Trees that looked like they'd been growing there for decades. I spent 2 hours searching that area, convinced I was just confused about the location, that I'd taken a wrong turn or misremembered the route. But I couldn't find any trace of the station. No foundation, no debris, no clearing where a building might have stood, just unbroken forest. When I got home, frustrated and confused, I checked my phone to make sure I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The photos were still there, all of them. The desk, the radio equipment, the coffee mug, the calendar showing the 15th of October 1983. Proof that the station had existed, that I'd been inside it, that everything I remembered was real. But if the station was real, where had it gone? I went through the photos again that night, looking at each one carefully. The interior shots showed exactly what I remembered: the preserved ranger station, frozen in 1983. The equipment looked functional. The papers looked recently written despite being decades old. Everything was exactly as I documented it. Then I reached the last photo. It was a shot I'd taken from just inside the doorway, looking back at the desk with the window visible behind it. I'd been checking the composition, making sure I captured the whole scene. I remembered taking it clearly, but I didn't remember what was in it. I zoomed in on the window, on the dirty glass that looked out at the forest. And there, barely visible through the grime, was a figure. Someone standing outside, maybe 20 feet from the station, partially obscured by trees. They were tall, taller than average and completely still, and they were facing the window, facing me. I could make out the basic shape of a human form, but the details were lost in the shadows and the dirty glass. No face, no clothing details, just a dark silhouette standing in the forest, watching the station, watching me. I dropped my phone, my hands suddenly shaking. I'd been alone on that hike. I was certain of it. I'd seen no one, heard no one. And when I'd taken that photo, I'd been focused on the interior of the station, not looking out the window at the forest beyond. But someone had been there, standing in the trees, perfectly still, watching me take photos inside a ranger station that had been abandoned since 1983. I picked up my phone and looked at the photo again, zooming in as far as the image quality would allow. The figure was there, undeniable now that I'd noticed it. And the more I looked at it, the less it looked like a hiker who'd happened to be passing by. The posture was wrong, too rigid, too deliberate, like they'd been standing there for a long time, waiting. I thought about Tom, the ranger who'd disappeared in October 1983, who'd radioed in about lights moving through the trees before his transmission cut out, who'd never been found, leaving his coffee on the desk and his calendar stopped on October 15th. And I thought about the station itself, preserved perfectly for 35 years, and then vanishing completely a week after I'd found it, as if it had never been there at all. I haven't gone back to Grouse Mountain since, haven't tried to find that service road again, or the spot where the station should have been. And I haven't posted the photos online again, haven't shown them to anyone except a few close friends who looked at them, shrugged, and said old ranger stations weren't that uncommon in BC's backcountry. But I look at that last photo sometimes. Late at night, when I can't sleep, I pull it up on my phone and zoom in on the window, on that figure standing in the shadows. And I wonder if they're still there, standing in a forest that's both exactly where it should be and somehow outside of normal time, watching a ranger station that appears and disappears, waiting for the next person to find it, waiting to be seen through dirty glass and captured in a photo they never meant to be in. I wonder if Tom saw them too, those lights moving through the trees that he radioed about. I wonder if he walked outside to investigate and found someone standing there in the darkness, tall and still, watching the station. I wonder if he's still there, somewhere in that forest that exists and doesn't exist, in a place marked on a calendar that stopped in 1983. And I wonder if I'll ever stop checking that photo, zooming in on that window, trying to make out details that refuse to resolve no matter how hard I look. But most of all, I wonder if going back, if finding that station again would answer any of my questions, or if it would just mean I'd never leave. The abandoned copper mine near Britannia Beach had been closed since the mid-70s, after years of environmental damage and declining ore quality finally forced the operation to shut down. By the time I was 19, in the summer of 2016, the whole site was fenced off and covered in warning signs about unstable structures, toxic contamination, and flooded shafts. Dangerous place. The kind of location that screamed, "Stay away," to anyone with common sense. Which is exactly why my friends and I decided to explore it. It was Marcus's idea. He was the kind of guy who was always looking for the next thrill, the next story to tell at parties. He'd heard about the old mine from someone at work, heard that people still snuck in through gaps in the fence to take photos and explore the ruins. He pitched it to our group, me, him, our friend Jen, and her boyfriend Tyler, as an adventure. Urban exploration, something to do on a boring Saturday instead of sitting around watching Netflix. I should have said no. Should have pointed out all the obvious reasons why breaking into an abandoned mine was a terrible idea. But I was 19, and 19-year-olds think they're invincible. So I said yes, and that Saturday afternoon, the four of us drove up the sea-to-sky highway to Britannia Beach. The mine site sat on the mountainside above the town, accessible by a rough access road that hadn't been maintained in decades. We parked at the base and hiked up, finding the fence exactly where Marcus said it would be. It was chain link, 10 feet high, topped with rusted barbed wire. But 50 meters down, someone had cut a gap in it, large enough to squeeze through. We went through one by one, stepping into what felt like a different world. The ruins of the mine stretched across the hillside, in a maze of collapsed buildings, rusted equipment, and crumbling concrete foundations. Everything was weathered and overgrown, nature slowly reclaiming what humans had abandoned. There were processing buildings with their roofs caved in, ore carts sitting on twisted tracks that led nowhere, massive pipes corroded through with holes. It looked post-apocalyptic, like we'd stepped forward 100 years instead of just 40. Marcus had his camera out, taking photos of everything. Jen and Tyler were exploring a collapsed shed, poking through old tools and machinery. I wandered a bit further up the slope, following what looked like a service road. The air smelled like rust and damp earth and something chemical I couldn't identify. Everything was silent except for the occasional clang of metal when someone kicked a piece of debris. That's when I found the main shaft. It was set back from the main ruins, partially hidden by brush and a rusted, corrugated metal shed that had long since lost its door. The shaft itself was protected by a metal grate, or it should have been. The grate was still there, but someone had cut through it with a torch or saw, leaving a gap big enough to fit through. Below the grate was darkness, pure, absolute darkness that the afternoon sun couldn't penetrate. I called the others over, and we gathered around the opening, peering down into the shaft. Marcus pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it into the darkness. The beam didn't reach the bottom, just showed rough rock walls disappearing into black emptiness. "How deep you think it goes?" Tyler asked. "Only one way to find out," Marcus said. He found a rock about the size of a baseball and held it over the opening. "Everybody listening?" We nodded. He dropped the rock. We counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then we heard it hit a distant crack and splash, like it had landed in water. The sound echoed up the shaft, bouncing off the walls, taking several seconds to fade. "At least 100 feet, Marcus said. "Maybe more. That's insane." We stood there looking down into the darkness, and I felt that natural human fear of deep holes, that primal understanding that falling into that shaft would mean death. Even if you survived the fall, you'd be trapped in flooded darkness with no way out. That's when we heard the voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of wind moving through the ruined buildings, but it was definitely a voice, echoing up from the bottom of the shaft. Human, male, speaking words we couldn't quite make out. We all froze, staring at each other. Jen grabbed Tyler's arm. Marcus leaned closer to the opening, trying to hear better. "Hello?" he called down into the shaft. His voice echoed and multiplied, bouncing off the walls. "Is someone down there?" We waited. For a moment, there was only silence and the echo of Marcus's voice fading. Then the voice came again, louder this time, clearer. "Yes, please help me." My stomach dropped. Someone was down there, trapped at the bottom of a flooded mine shaft, calling for help. How long had they been there? How had they gotten down? Why hadn't anyone heard them before? "We're going to get help," Marcus shouted down. "Hold on." The voice responded immediately. "Please help me. I've been here so long." The words echoed up to us, distorted by the shaft, but unmistakable. Someone was trapped down there, and they'd been there for a long time. Days, weeks. The desperation in that voice made my skin crawl. Tyler already had his phone out, dialing 911. He stepped away from the shaft, speaking quickly to the operator, explaining where we were and what we'd heard. The rest of us stayed by the opening, taking turns calling down reassurances, telling whoever was down there that help was coming, that they just needed to hold on. But the voice didn't respond again. No matter how many times we called down, we got nothing back except our own echoes. Search and rescue arrived about 2 hours later. 2 teams, one from Squamish, one from Vancouver, along with a couple of RCMP officers who didn't look thrilled about us being in the mine but focused on the more immediate problem. They set up equipment at the shaft opening, industrial lights, and a camera system mounted on a cable. One of the rescue coordinators, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and safety gear that looked like it had seen decades of use, asked us what we'd heard. We told him everything, the voice calling for help, the words about being down there for a long time, the way it had responded when we called down. He listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When we finished, he said, "How long ago did you hear it?" "Maybe 2.5 hours, Marcus said, "right before we called." The coordinator nodded and turned to his team. They started lowering the camera down the shaft, playing out cable meter by meter. We watched the video feed on a monitor. They'd set up grainy footage of rock walls sliding past, darkness pressing in from all sides. The shaft went straight down for what looked like forever, the walls slick with moisture and mineral deposits. Then the camera hit water. The feed showed dark, murky liquid, the light from the camera creating a small circle of visibility. The bottom of the shaft was completely flooded. The coordinator adjusted something, and the camera went underwater, revealing nothing but silt and murk. They panned it around slowly, methodically, searching for any sign of a person. Nothing. The shaft was empty except for water and debris. They pulled the camera back up and checked the reading. 40 meters of water, the coordinator said. That shaft's been flooded since the mine closed. There's no way anyone could be alive down there. But we heard someone, Jen said. Her voice was tight, controlled. All four of us heard it. It said it needed help. The coordinator looked at us with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sympathy, maybe, or weariness. Sound does strange things in mine shafts, he said. Wind, water movement, structural settling. It can create echoes and vibrations that sound like voices. It happens. This wasn't wind, Marcus said. It responded to us. It answered when we called down. Are you sure? The coordinator's tone wasn't accusatory, just tired. Echoes can do that too. Your own voices bouncing back in ways that make them sound different. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've heard it before. We didn't know what to say to that. The four of us exchanged glances, each of us clearly remembering what we'd heard, knowing it had been more than just echoes. But how could we argue with the evidence? The camera had shown nothing. The shaft was flooded and had been for decades. No one could survive down there. The teams packed up their equipment, and one of the RCMP officers gave us a stern warning about trespassing on dangerous industrial sites before telling us to leave. We walked back down the mountain in silence, processing what had happened. When we reached Marcus's car, Jen turned to the rest of us. We all heard it, right? That wasn't just in our heads? We nodded. All of us had heard it. All of us had heard that voice call for help, had heard it say it had been down there for a long time. But apparently, it had been down there for much longer than even it realized. We drove back to Vancouver, mostly in silence. I kept thinking about that voice, about the desperation in it, about the words, "I've been here so long." How long was long? Days, months, years, decades? I tried to research the mine when I got home, looking for any accidents or disappearances associated with it. I found plenty of environmental reports and historical records about the mining operation, but nothing about anyone going missing. No unexplained deaths. No reports of trapped workers. Just the routine hazards of industrial mining and the eventual closure in the 70s. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been down there, that the voice we'd heard was real, not just echoes or wind, that someone had been trapped in that flooded shaft, calling for help for longer than any human should be able to survive. I didn't go back. Told myself it was because of the trespassing warning, because of the danger, because there was nothing more to find. But the truth was simpler. I was scared. Scared of what we'd heard, scared of what it might mean. 3 weeks later, I was driving up the Sea to Sky highway for a completely unrelated reason, visiting a friend in Whistler, and I passed the turnoff for Britannia Beach. I slowed down without really meaning to, looking up at the mountainside where the mine ruins sat hidden in the trees. And I heard it, faint but unmistakable, a voice. Not from the mine was kilometers away, up the mountain, but in my head, clear as if someone was sitting in the backseat of my car. My name, just my name, spoken in that same desperate tone we'd heard echoing from the shaft. I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel, and didn't stop until I was 20 kilometers past Britannia Beach. I checked my back seat, empty. I checked my phone, nothing. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just the memory of that day getting mixed up with the stress of driving. But I heard it again a week later. I was home, alone in my apartment, and I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of someone saying my name. The same voice, the same tone. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and looked around the dark room. Empty, nothing there. It's been 7 years since that day at the mine. I've heard that voice maybe a dozen times since then. Never when I expect it, never when I'm thinking about it. Just randomly in crowded places. While I'm driving, once while I was at work. Always the same, always just my name, spoken in that hollow, desperate tone. I've tried to tell myself it's psychological, that I've internalized what we heard that day, and my brain replays it when I'm stressed or tired. But it doesn't feel like that. It feels like something else. Like someone or something learned my name that day when I stood at the edge of that shaft and called down into the darkness. Like whatever was down there, whatever spoke to us from the bottom of that flooded mine, wasn't asking for help at all. It was just letting us know it was there, and that it heard us, and that it would remember. I don't drive past Britannia Beach anymore. I take the long route when I need to go north, adding an hour to my trip just to avoid that stretch of highway. And I try not to think about that voice, about the way it said my name, about the question I can't answer. If there was nothing down there, nothing alive in that flooded shaft, then what spoke to us? And why, after all these years, can I still hear it calling?